Security. Escort him out, Victoria Hale said, her voice smooth and cold, cutting through the conference room like it belonged there more than anyone else, like it had practiced that kind of dismissal 1,000 times before. A few people chuckled. Someone shifted in their chair. Another leaned back, arms crossed, already deciding the outcome. Ethan Cole didn't move. He stood alone at the far end of the polished oak table, his worn jacket still on, his hands resting calmly at his sides, as if he had stepped into the wrong room, but refused to apologize for it. "You heard me," Victoria added, not raising her voice, just sharpening it. "We don't have time for mistakes today." The room hummed softly under fluorescent lights, a low buzz that echoed off glass walls and chrome fixtures, the kind of corporate quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, just waiting for something to break it. Ethan's eyes moved once across the room, not in panic, not in defense, just observing, like a man measuring distance instead of danger. "Is that what this is?" he asked, his voice low, steady, almost too calm for the moment. A few heads turned. Victoria tilted her chin slightly, amused now. "It's exactly what it is," she replied, tapping a manicured finger against the tablet screen. "A liability we're correcting." Another ripple of laughter, softer this time, more confident. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something only he could see. He didn't argue. He didn't step forward. He didn't shrink. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched in sharp lines and morning light, traffic inching along streets 30 floors below, unaware that inside this room, a man's name was being quietly dismantled. Ethan adjusted his sleeve, a small motion, almost invisible, but deliberate, like someone preparing for something that hadn't happened yet. "You cost this company a contract," Victoria continued, her tone now carrying the rhythm of a rehearsed conclusion. "And unless you have something meaningful to say, we're done here." Silence hovered for a second, thin and fragile. Then a chair creaked. A pen clicked. Someone whispered, "Just go." Ethan inhaled slowly, not deeply, just enough, like a man grounding himself in something steady. His gaze didn't rise to meet the laughter. It settled instead on the table, on the reflections in the polished surface, on the faint distortions of people who thought they understood the moment. "I'm not here to argue," he said quietly. That drew a pause. Not long, but enough. Victoria's smile tightened just a fraction. "Then why are you here, Mr. Cole?" she asked. Ethan lifted his eyes now, not sharp, not defiant, just clear. "I'm here for the truth." And for the first time since he walked in, the room didn't laugh. The room did not move right away, but something inside it shifted, subtle and quiet, like a breath held too long finally beginning to loosen, and Ethan Cole stood there without rushing to fill the space, without raising his voice, without trying to win anyone over, because men who carry truth do not chase attention, they wait for it to arrive on its own. Victoria Hale let out a soft exhale through her nose, a sound almost like a laugh, but sharper, more controlled, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, as if reclaiming the room by posture alone. "The truth?" she repeated, her tone light, but edged with disbelief. "You think this is about truth?" A few people smiled again, but not as confidently as before, not as loud, as if something in Ethan's stillness had made them reconsider the script they were following. Ethan did not respond immediately. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the table, steady, grounded, a small motion that carried more intention than any raised voice ever could. "Yes," he said simply. No defense, no explanation, just that one word. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting a pale glow across polished surfaces, and somewhere near the back, a coffee cup was set down a little too carefully, the sound soft but noticeable in a room that had begun, slowly, to listen. Victoria tapped her tablet again, this time a little faster, pulling up slides that glowed on the large screen behind her, charts and timelines and highlighted errors arranged in neat, persuasive order. "Here is the truth," she said, gesturing toward the data, her voice regaining its rhythm. "Missed deadlines, corrupted files, a failed deployment that cost this company over $2 million in projected revenue." A murmur followed, quieter now, more cautious than before. Ethan glanced at the screen, not with panic, not with confusion, but with recognition, as if he had seen all of this before, as if he had been expecting it. "Say something," one of the executives muttered under his breath, Not quite a command, not quite a plea. Ethan lifted his eyes again, calm, steady. I will, he replied. The air felt different now, heavier, like the moment just before a storm decides whether it will break or pass. Outside, sunlight reflected off neighboring glass towers, flickering faintly across the conference room walls, and for a brief second, Ethan's reflection overlapped with theirs on the table's surface, distorted but present, impossible to ignore. Victoria crossed her arms, watching him more closely now, not amused anymore, not entirely certain. Go ahead, she said, her voice quieter than before, though she did not intend it to be. Ethan nodded once, not in submission, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of something deeper than either. Before I answer, he said, his tone even, I would like to understand one thing. A pause followed, longer this time, stretching across the room like a line no one wanted to cross too quickly. Which version of the data are you showing them? And just like that, the rhythm broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the room, for the second time, forgot how to laugh. The question did not land loudly, but it landed precisely, and that was enough, because precision has a way of cutting deeper than volume ever could, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Not even Victoria Hale, whose fingers hovered just above her tablet as if the answer were already there, but suddenly harder to reach. Excuse me, she said, her tone measured, controlled, but no longer effortless. Ethan did not step forward. He did not repeat himself. He simply held the moment, allowing the weight of the question to settle into the room, into the polished table, into the quiet minds that had just begun, for the first time, to question what they were being shown. The version of the data, he continued calmly, the one you selected for this presentation, where exactly was it pulled from? A chair shifted. Someone leaned closer to the screen. Another executive narrowed his eyes, glancing between Victoria and the numbers displayed behind her. Victoria straightened slightly, her posture returning to its sharp, composed alignment. From the company's servers, she replied, her voice firm again, though a fraction tighter than before. The same place your work is stored. A few nods followed, small, hesitant, but still present, like people trying to return to familiar ground. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging her answer without accepting it. Which server? He asked. The words were simple, almost quiet, but they did not drift away this time. They stayed. They pressed. Victoria's jaw tightened just enough to notice. That is not relevant, she said, quicker now. The outcome is what matters. A soft murmur passed through the room, not agreement, not disagreement, just uncertainty beginning to take shape. Ethan's gaze did not shift. It is relevant, he said, still calm, still grounded, because there are 3 mirrored environments, and only one of them contains the original deployment logs. Silence followed, heavier now, more defined, like a line being drawn where none had existed before. One of the senior executives leaned forward, elbows on the table. Is that true? He asked, not to Ethan, but to Victoria. She did not answer immediately. The fluorescent lights above seemed louder now, the faint hum stretching across the room like static between 2 signals that no longer aligned. Ethan let the silence breathe for a second longer, then added, and only one of those environments records manual overrides. That landed differently. A pen stopped mid-click. A woman near the end of the table glanced back at the screen, then at Victoria, then back again, as if the numbers had quietly changed shape without moving at all. Victoria exhaled slowly, placing her tablet flat against the table with more control than necessary. We are not here to debate technicalities, she said, her voice steady but no longer smooth. We are here to address responsibility. Ethan nodded again, as if agreeing in principle, but not in detail. Exactly, he said. A pause followed, brief but unmistakable. That is why the source matters. And just like that, the room did not feel like hers anymore. Not entirely. Not the way it had just minutes ago, because truth does not need to raise its voice when the right question has already begun to answer itself. No one spoke right away, not because they agreed, not because they understood everything, but because something in the rhythm had changed, and when rhythm breaks, people listen differently, more carefully, as if even their own thoughts need permission to continue. Ethan Cole did not move to fill the silence. He let it stretch, let it settle, the way a man does when he knows the next words matter more than the last ones. Across the table, Victoria Hale held her posture, straight-backed, composed, but there was a stillness in her now that had not been there before, a quiet recalibration behind her eyes that only the most attentive could notice. "You are suggesting," she said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "that the data presented here is inaccurate." It sounded strong, almost like a recovery, but it did not carry the same effortless authority as before. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, his voice even. "I am suggesting that it is incomplete." A faint shift moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but real, like a current changing direction beneath still water. One of the executives glanced again at the screen, this time not to confirm what he believed, but to question what he had accepted too quickly. Victoria leaned forward now, resting her hands lightly on the table, anchoring herself back into control. "Then clarify," she said, her tone sharper. "Because from where we are sitting, the results are very clear." Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the request, not resisting it. "Results can be clear," he said, "and still not be true." The words did not rise, but they did not need to. They landed with a quiet weight that did not ask for attention, it demanded consideration. A pen rolled slightly across the table and stopped. Someone near the back folded their arms, not in dismissal this time, but in thought. The fluorescent lights flickered once, almost imperceptibly, casting a brief shift in shadow across the room, and in that moment, the reflections on the table no longer looked aligned. Ethan took a small step closer, not invading space, just closing distance enough to be heard without effort. "The deployment logs you are showing," he continued. "They begin at 2:14 p.m. Victoria's eyes flicked toward the screen for a fraction of a second before returning to him. "Yes," she said, quickly. "That is when the failure occurred." Ethan tilted his head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet correction. "That is when the failure was recorded," he said. A pause followed, subtle but significant. "There is a difference." The room felt it. Not everyone could explain it, but they felt it, the shift from conclusion to question, from certainty to possibility. Victoria's fingers pressed lightly against the table's surface, her control still present, but no longer effortless. "If you have something to present," she said, "then present it." Ethan looked at her, not with defiance, not with victory, but with a kind of calm that does not come from being right, but from being ready. "I will," he said quietly. And then, just before he continued, just before the next piece fell into place, the room, for the first time since the meeting began, felt like it was waiting for him, not for her. The room held its breath without knowing it, and Ethan Cole did not rush to break that fragile stillness because truth, when it is close, does not need speed, it needs space. He reached into his worn leather folder, not dramatically, not as a reveal, just a simple motion, the kind a man makes when he has nothing to prove and everything to show. "The logs begin at 2:14 p.m., he repeated, his voice steady, measured. But the system was accessed at 1:52 p.m. A faint stir moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Victoria Hale did not speak this time. Her eyes remained on him, sharper now, calculating. Ethan placed a single printed sheet on the table and gently turned it so the nearest executive could read it. "This is the original access log," he said, "pulled from the primary server, not the mirrored environment." The paper made a soft sound against the polished surface, louder than it should have been, or maybe the room had simply grown quiet enough to hear it. "That is not part of the official report," Victoria said quickly, her voice returning, but not as effortlessly as before. Ethan nodded once. "It is not," he agreed, "because it was not included." 3 short sentences. Simple. Direct. No accusation. Just structure. The executive closest to the document leaned forward, scanning the timestamps, his brow tightening slightly as he followed the sequence. 1:52, he murmured under his breath. "That is 22 minutes before the failure was recorded." Another voice joined, softer. "That means something was changed before the crash." The air shifted again, this time more noticeably, like a current no longer hidden beneath the surface. Victoria straightened, her hands now resting firmly on the table. "There are always preliminary interactions," she said, controlled, but faster now. "That does not indicate fault." Ethan did not interrupt. He waited, let her finish, then answered. Agreed, he said calmly. Preliminary interactions do not indicate fault. A brief pause. But manual overrides do. That landed differently. A chair creaked. Someone inhaled sharply, not loud, but enough. Ethan slid a second page forward, placing it beside the first, aligning the edges carefully, almost respectfully. At 1:58 p.m., he continued, a manual override was executed on the system configuration. The executive reading the page looked up, this time directly at Victoria. Who authorized that? He asked. No one moved immediately. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, steady, indifferent, but the room beneath them was no longer steady at all. Victoria's lips parted slightly, then closed again, her composure still present, but now carrying weight. That override was necessary, she said finally. Ethan nodded, not disagreeing, not challenging the necessity. It may have been, he said. Another pause. Measured. Intentional. But it was not recorded in the report you presented. Silence followed, heavier now, not empty, but full, filled with the quiet realization that something had been left out, not by accident, not by oversight, but by choice. And in that silence, for the first time, the question was no longer whether Ethan Cole had something to say, but why it had not been said sooner. No one rushed to answer the question that had just been placed in the center of the room, not because they did not hear it, but because they understood it, and understanding has a way of slowing everything down. The executive who asked it did not repeat himself. He simply watched, waiting, his eyes no longer on the screen, no longer on the documents, but on Victoria Hale. She remained still for a moment longer than before, her posture intact, her presence still composed, but something beneath that surface had shifted, something quieter, something harder to control. It was authorized internally, she said at last, her voice measured, careful, as if each word had to pass through a filter before it could be spoken. A few heads turned, not toward Ethan this time, but toward her. Ethan did not interrupt. He did not press. He simply stood there, steady, allowing the answer to exist exactly as it was, incomplete. Internally, the same executive repeated, slower now. By who? The room did not echo the question, but it absorbed it. The fluorescent lights continued their soft hum above, indifferent to the shift happening below, but the people beneath them were no longer indifferent at all. Victoria's fingers pressed lightly against the table, then relaxed, then pressed again, a small rhythm that betrayed the effort it took to remain composed. That level of detail is not relevant to the outcome, she said, her tone firmer now, but not stronger, just more deliberate. Ethan's gaze remained calm, grounded, not fixed on her, but present in the space between them, where the truth was slowly beginning to take shape. It becomes relevant, he said quietly, when responsibility is assigned. 3 short sentences followed, each one landing clean, measured, without force. An action was taken. A system was changed. A result followed. He paused, just long. Enough. Those things are connected. No one laughed. No one shifted. Even the small, unconscious sounds that had filled the room earlier, the tapping, the clicking, the whispering, had disappeared. The executive closest to the documents leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, as if recalibrating everything he had just accepted minutes ago. Was the override tested? Someone else asked, this time from farther down the table. Victoria turned her head slightly toward the voice, then back again, maintaining control, but now moving within a narrower space. It was implemented under time constraints, she replied. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Without full testing, he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a completion. The words settled heavily, not because they were loud, but because they were clear. Outside, a faint reflection of passing clouds drifted across the glass walls, slow, quiet, almost unnoticed, but inside the room, everything had become sharply visible. Ethan took a small breath, steady, unhurried. The system did not fail on its own, he continued. It was changed. A pause followed. Then one more sentence, softer than the rest. And that change was not mine. The room did not react immediately. It did not need to. Because in that moment, the weight had shifted completely, not in volume, not in spectacle, but in truth. And for the first time since the meeting began, The question was no longer whether Ethan Cole was responsible, but whether Victoria Hale had just revealed more than she intended. The words did not echo, but they stayed. And sometimes that is more powerful. When something stays instead of fading, when it settles into the room and refuses to be ignored. And Ethan Cole stood there, without claiming the moment, without leaning into it, because this was never about winning, it was about revealing. No one spoke for a few seconds, and in a room that had been so quick to judge, that silence carried more meaning than any argument ever could. Victoria Hale did not look at him immediately. Her gaze shifted instead to the documents on the table, then to the screen behind her, then briefly toward the executives who were no longer looking at her the same way. "That is an assumption," she said finally, her voice steady, but thinner now, like something stretched too tightly. Ethan shook his head once, slow calm. "It is not," he replied. He did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply reached into his folder again and pulled out a third document, placing it gently beside the others, aligning it with the same quiet precision as before. "The override required a level 4 authorization," he said. "There are only 3 people in this building with that access." A pause followed. "Not long, but enough. I am not one of them." A subtle shift rippled through the room, this time more visible, more defined. One executive leaned forward, another sat back, arms no longer crossed, but resting open, uncertain. Someone near the far end whispered something under their breath, but no one responded. The room had moved past whispering. It was listening now. Victoria's expression did not collapse. It did not need to. It simply held, controlled, composed, but no longer untouchable. "Access does not prove intent," she said, carefully. Ethan nodded again. "Agreed," he answered. Another 3-beat rhythm, calm and deliberate. "Access does not prove intent. Intent does not prove action. But action leaves a record." He let that sit for a second, then added, quietly, "And records do not guess." The executive closest to the table turned the page slightly, scanning the authorization line, his eyes narrowing just enough to show the shift happening inside him. "This is your login credential," he said slowly, looking up, not at Ethan this time, but at Victoria. No one corrected him. No one interrupted. The fluorescent lights above seemed louder now, or maybe the room had simply become quiet enough to hear everything it had ignored before. Victoria's fingers rested still against the table now, no longer tapping, no longer adjusting, just still, as if movement itself might say too much. "There are protocols," she began, her voice measured, but not as grounded as before. "Shared access, delegated permissions, emergency." Ethan did not cut her off. He waited. He always waited. Then, gently, when her sentence reached its edge, he spoke. "Then show them," he said. Not loud, not forceful, just clear. "Show them the delegation log." That landed differently. It was not a statement. It was not a defense. It was an invitation, one that could not be answered with tone or posture or control, only with truth. The room shifted again, but this time it did not return to where it had been. Because now, for the first time, the weight of the moment did not belong to the man who had been accused. It belonged to the one who had been certain, and certainty, when it begins to crack, does not make noise, it makes silence. No one reached for the screen. No one touched the tablet. The invitation Ethan had placed in the center of the room did not demand a response, but it required one, and that was the difference, because demands can be ignored, but truth waits, and waiting has a way of making silence heavier with every second. Victoria Hale remained still, her posture upright, her presence intact, but the ease that once defined her was gone, replaced by something quieter, something measured, something that had to be held together instead of simply existing. "There is no delegation log," she said at last, her voice calm, controlled, but carrying a weight it did not have before. It was not loud. It was not defensive. It was precise. And that precision changed everything. A subtle shift moved through the room, not in sound, but in attention, as if every person present had just heard something more than what was spoken. Ethan did not react. He did not nod. He did not challenge. He simply let the words exist exactly as they were, complete. "Then the access was not delegated," he said quietly. One sentence. No emphasis. No accusation. Just alignment. A chair creaked near the far end of the table. Someone exhaled slowly. The executive who had been reading the documents lowered the page slightly, his eyes no longer scanning, but fixed, steady, thinking. Victoria's gaze moved across the room, not searching for support, but measuring distance, recalibrating presence, holding what remained of control in a space that no longer responded the same way. The override was necessary to meet the deadline. She continued, her tone regaining structure, but not authority. Delays would have cost more than the risk. A few heads nodded faintly, not in agreement, but in recognition of the logic, the kind of logic that often justifies decisions made too quickly. Ethan listened. He always listened. Then he answered. Deadlines measure time, he said. A brief pause. They do not measure truth. The words settled differently than anything before them. Not sharp, not loud, just clear. The room did not move. It did not need to, because something had already shifted beyond movement. The screen behind Victoria still displayed the same charts, the same numbers, the same conclusions, but they no longer carried certainty, only context, and context, once questioned, does not return to what it was. One of the senior executives leaned back slowly, his hands resting on the armrests now, no longer engaged with the presentation, but with the moment itself. So the system was changed, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Another voice followed, softer, and the change was not reported. Victoria did not interrupt them. She could not because she lacked words, but because the space no longer belonged to her voice alone. Ethan remained where he was, steady, grounded, not stepping forward to claim what was unfolding, not stepping back to avoid it. He simply stood in it, like a man who had already made peace with the outcome before it arrived. The fluorescent lights hummed above, steady as ever, but beneath them, the room had become something else entirely, not a place of presentation, not a place of judgment, but a place of realization. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if to speak again, but no sound followed. And in that moment, it was not her authority that filled the room, not her certainty, not her control, but the absence of all three, because sometimes the loudest moment is not when someone speaks, but when they no longer can, and the room, without a single instruction, without a single raised voice, fell completely, undeniably silent. The silence did not break right away, and that was what made it powerful, not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding, the kind that settles slowly into a room and changes the way people sit, the way they look, the way they think. Ethan Cole did not speak into it. He did not move to claim it. He simply stood there, steady, as if the outcome had never belonged to him in the first place. Across the table, Victoria Hale remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but something behind it had shifted beyond repair, not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. One of the senior executives cleared his throat, the sound soft but decisive. "We will need to review this," he said, not loudly, but with a tone that carried authority without force. Another nodded. All of it. Papers were adjusted, screens dimmed slightly, and the energy that once filled the room with certainty now moved differently, quieter, more careful, as if every assumption had to earn its place again. Victoria did not respond immediately. Her gaze rested briefly on the documents in front of her, then lifted, not toward Ethan, but toward the room that no longer followed her lead. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, choosing silence not as a strategy, but as the only honest response left. Ethan watched for a moment, not with judgment, not with triumph, just with clarity. Then he reached forward and gently gathered the papers he had placed on the table, aligning them once more before slipping them back into his folder. The motion was small, almost unnoticeable, but deliberate, like a man closing a chapter without needing recognition for it. "Mr. Cole," the executive at the head of the table said, his voice measured, respectful now in a way it had not been before. "We appreciate your clarification." Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I did not come to clarify," he said quietly. A brief pause followed. "I came to make sure the truth was not lost." The words did not demand agreement. They did not ask for approval. They simply existed, complete on their own. No one argued. No one corrected him. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to dispute. Ethan turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple shift of direction, and began to walk toward the door. No one stopped him. No one called after him. But as he reached the glass, a subtle movement followed. One executive straightening in his chair, another lowering his gaze, a third watching him with a quiet respect that had not been there before. Ethan paused for just a second, his hand resting lightly on the handle, and for a brief moment, something softer crossed his mind, a memory of a small voice that